This channel is supported by TrueFire. TrueFire is an online library of lessons from some of my favourite players. There's thousands of lessons on there. You can use the promo code JNC40 to get 40% off of any of their courses. So I actually did a video which caused some people some amount of incredulity, some sort of, they were surprised by what I was saying, and a bunch of people thought that maybe I was sponsored by Epiphone or something for stating that the Epiphone Lazarus that I had just bought was better than the Gibson Standard, Les Paul Standard that I had bought from when was it, like this time last year really. And it seems odd to me. I'm presuming that these are folks that are not really familiar with what happens or what I do on the channel, which is completely fine, right? Because you know, you don't need to know about what I'm doing over here. But in general, if I've been given a piece of gear, I'm going to tell you that, obviously, and I don't quite get how it would make sense for Gibson, who own Epiphone, to have people, you know, making sponsored videos saying that the Epiphones are better than the Gibsons. The other thing that I sort of have been seeing is around this idea that an Epiphone is like for poor people or something like that, which seems to me to be a bit of a snobbish attitude and is maybe somewhat lacking in understanding about what the Epiphone Lazarus actually was, or lacking in understanding about how things are made and this sort of stuff. And I thought to myself, like, maybe they have a point, I'm not sure. So what is the difference between a Gibson Les Paul and an Epiphone Les Paul? There are some. They're not necessarily glaringly obvious ones. I looked up some videos, so I decided let's look at a Gibson USA factory tour. There happens to be one where the governor of Authentic himself, Mark Agnesi, is walking around the Gibson USA shop.
Let's go check out how these guitars are made right here at Gibson USA.
There's also one where they're walking around the Gibson custom shop, and I then also found an Epiphone China video, right? A video of them going around the Epiphone China factory. I sort of recommend taking a look at each of them. What stood out to me was that it all looks remarkably similar, right? There are just different people doing the different tasks. Most of the tasks happen to be pretty much the same. In each of the places, the frets are getting pressed in with a machine. One of them has a laser, the other ones don't. You know, that happens to be the China one has a laser for whatever reason. And something else jumped out to me So apparently it takes 2 weeks for a Gibson Les Paul Standard to go from, coming into the factory to leaving.
2 weeks from a log to a finished guitar in the case, ready for somebody to pick it up. It's absolutely amazing.
And that seems quite quick in terms of turnaround, because having painted a few guitars on nitro myself, like the time that it takes to cure is quite long. So I was quite surprised by that. A $2,800 is apparently the price of a Gibson Les Paul Standard for you guys in America. In the UK, they're about £2,000, which is a little bit less, when you take into account the exchange rate. So for some reason, there's a smaller gap for us over here between the Gibson Les Paul and like the Epiphone Lazarus that I was looking at. Anyway, another thing that jumped out to me that they said was that apparently the binding is one of the more skilled jobs that people have to do, scraping the binding. So basically they paint over the entire guitar once they've attached the binding, which is again apparently one of the more skilled jobs, gluing the piece of wood and kind of wrapping it. Now, for what are apparently, according to the guys who run the place, the most skilled jobs, apparently the people that do those jobs have been trained for 2 months. That's the apprenticeship length.
What are some of those roles that really take a significant apprenticeship to get on the floor?
The most significant would be scraping the binding. That takes an incredible amount of skill and finesse. Wrapping the binding on guitar bodies, hand rolling necks, neck fitting the neck to the body. All of those are probably the pinnacle of the craftsmanship. All of those tasks I just mentioned take a minimum 2 months to train someone to do those properly.
Now that to me doesn't sound like a hugely skilled job, to be honest. Like if you think about some of the other jobs, I don't know what job you might do, but 2 months of training to be from, getting your job and then signed off after 2 months, to me doesn't really sound like, I don't know. Anyway, that's a judgment for you guys to make. But apprenticeships in the UK typically are like a year to 2 to 3 years. It's like a thing that people do after they kind of leave college or whatever. They go into an apprenticeship and it's like generally a couple of years process. For an apprenticeship to be over within like 2 months before you're actually doing the main job, that to me doesn't sound like, anyway, So I would have thought that making a Les Paul was a little bit more difficult than apparently, according to these people who actually make them, it possibly is. In any case, what it made me think was that actually what matters most is like the people that are working on these guitars more than anything else. Apparently in Epiphone, China, a lot of the employees there have been working there for about 12 years. They don't say within some of the other Gibson videos, the length of service that some of these people have been there for, but apparently if you've been working at the Gibson factory for 20 years, you get a Les Paul Supreme, apparently. Another number that came out was that 700 guitars a week, I think it was, are made at the Epiphone China factory. And all it really made me think was, why would it be surprising to anyone then that potentially, if you're building these guitars, they are mass manufactured guitars. Even the Gibson custom shop is churning out a bunch of guitars and loads of people will have worked on them. Like I think it's the Murphy Lab is around about 4 to 6 people or something like that. That's like the smallest part of the Gibson production, except for, I guess, like the master built stuff, whatever they call that. But the custom shop is churning stuff out at a rate, and the Gibson USA in Nashville is churning stuff out at an even bigger rate. And these people that are working on them, they are just people. Some of them are probably fairly new to the job. Some have probably been there for ages. It is a factory, and I've never worked in a factory. I'm sure some of you have. Presumably, the job of the factory is to build these things to specification, as efficiently as possible, and to have good quality control and stuff like that. But ultimately, we've all heard stories about Gibson's quality control, haven't we? Right. Anyway, so for me, it wasn't necessarily that crazy to believe that this Epiphone Lazarus, there were 2,000 of these built, could be better than my Les Paul Standard from 2002, because at the end of the day, there's no point in any of these factories where they're literally kind of sprinkling them with magic. They are just guitars being built en masse by people. And at the end of the day, the spec on this guitar, neither the Les Paul Standard 50s nor this Les Paul Lazarus are exactly built to the historic spec, but some of the things that maybe matter, like a long tenon, if you think that matters, or a laurel fretboard versus rosewood, those are some of the differences. And I think there is a reason, presumably, that Gibson only build the long tenon on the more expensive models. Perhaps there's a way to charge more for equivalent guitars. But for me, all this buying this guitar showed me was that for sure you can get some great guitars at any price range really, and this isn't even a cheap guitar, is it? Let's be honest, like £1,000 nearly. You know, they're $800, £850, something like that. It's not a cheap guitar when you consider that most of the price is tied up in the labour. The labour in China is cheaper. Probably the amount of time it takes to make one of these is probably the same as a Les Paul standard, I'd wager. You know, if it's only taken 2 weeks to build one of them. So that's why it's cheaper. And, you know, it's got a Laurel fretboard. Is that a big deal? Doesn't seam it under the fingers. But the spec on this are the things that people paid loads more for in a Gibson. Things like that long tenon are kind of there. I like the way it looks. To me, it looks better than the other one, in my opinion. It plays a little bit better, and I think a lot of people in the video said they thought it sounded better. Obviously, it's not exactly the same pickups, but in that case, is that not a better guitar? I thought it probably was. Similarly, the PRS DGT SE. If I'd been able to come to you and say that I thought this was a crap guitar, it would have got me more views than just saying it's actually pretty decent. I didn't necessarily expect either the Epiphone or the PRS to be that impressive, but again, the PRS, I've watched both of their factory tours in Maryland and the ones in Indonesia. It looks, again, really similar the way they're building these guitars. The only difference is the people that are actually making them. And from Yamaha, I know that they do actually spend quite a bit of time trying to skill up the workers and skill up the guitars and get them to a certain level of quality. I believe that to be the case anyway, from what I've been told. But yeah, I bought a PRS DGT SE for the same reason that possibly you watch some videos wondering whether it was something to be skeptical about. And again, I can say honestly that I preferred this one to the PRS DGT core that I had. And, you know, it doesn't make much difference to me whether I say that or not. I'm only saying it because I believe it to be the case. And so, yeah, I don't know. To me, I think in the past I would have probably thought, well, obviously the American stuff is better. But now that I've seen some of these videos, I'm asking myself, well, what really are the differences? Is there stuff that we should care about? And I'd be looking more closely really at the spec of the guitar. For instance, like the Ibanez AZ premium versus prestige stuff, the AZs, the premium spec was more or less the same as the prestige. So there's no reason, once you put them side by side, why an Indonesian one wouldn't in some cases be better than the prestige and vice versa. Similarly, if you got a Les Paul made in China by people that are doing the best they can, with good spec, you know, if they've gone to the effort of kind of collaborating with Gibson to put in some decent pickups, some decent wiring, to spec out some neck dimensions that people like, and to spec out, you know, a long tenon join, why wouldn't that be just as good as a standard? Worth playing them to find out, and people in the comments, some people had a similar experience, some people preferred standards. Equally, some people have found that these have got sharp frets, but that's the thing, innit? You play the guitar to find out what they're like. So what I've learned from this is that some people are only really shopping for a badge in a lot of ways, whereas for me, you know, I'm not necessarily that snobby. I quite like the idea of a guitar that is cheaper but also really good. That to me, value does play a factor into how I think about guitars. It's why I like the Sire guitars. It's why I really like the FGN guitars, and it's why possibly part of why I preferred this to the Les Paul standard that I bought. It's just a really good guitar for the money, I thought. So that hopefully clears up some of that, maybe. I don't know.